The Roman garrison at Caesarea Maritima received the report on a Tuesday. A merchant vessel had been taken 3 miles off the coast. 12 sailors. Cargo stripped clean, grain, purple dye, 2 crates of Lebanese cedar. The crew was found alive, drifting in a longboat with no oars. Their hands had been tied with rope, then cut loose. The kind of precision that says, "We want you to survive. We want you to tell people what you saw." The garrison commander filed the report, marked it as routine. This was the coast of Roman Judea in 28 AD. It happened 3 times a month. Here is what no Sunday school class, no seminary, no Hollywood biblical epic has ever told you. The world Jesus walked through, the shores where he preached, the fishing villages where he recruited his disciples, the waters of the Sea of Galilee, the trade routes he traveled, was saturated with piracy. Not the occasional raid, not a distant rumor. Organized, systematic, violent maritime crime that Rome had been fighting for over a century, and by 28 AD, had largely given up trying to control. The Sea of Galilee was a pirate lake. And the men Jesus chose as his first followers, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, were not peaceful fishermen in a tranquil bay. They were operating in one of the most contested, most surveilled, most dangerous bodies of water in the ancient world. And the Bible never mentioned it once. What you're about to hear is not a theological argument. It's not an attack on Scripture. It's not a reinterpretation designed to shock. It's a reconstruction built from Roman military records, from Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian whose works are the closest thing we have to a newspaper from the world Jesus inhabited, from archaeological digs at Magdala and Tiberias, from maritime trade records, and from a document most people have never heard of, the Lex Gabinia, Rome's emergency piracy legislation, passed in 67 BC in direct response to a crisis so severe it had strangled the grain supply of the entire Mediterranean. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand something that changes the entire texture of the gospel stories. The miracles didn't happen in a pastoral setting. They happened in a militarized fishing economy controlled, on one side, by Roman tax collectors, and, on the other, by a shadow network of coastal raiders, black market fish traders, and revolutionary bandits who were, depending on who you asked, criminals or freedom fighters. The lake was the border between 2 worlds, and Jesus walked directly into the middle of it. Stay until the end, because the last piece of this story, the one about what happened to the town of Magdala and what that tells us about Mary Magdalene's real background, is the part that will make you rethink everything. First, the geography, because it matters more than almost any other fact in this story. The Sea of Galilee, called Yam Kinneret in Hebrew, Lake Tiberias in Roman records, is not a sea. It's a freshwater lake, roughly 21 kilometers long, 12 wide, sitting 209 meters below sea level, surrounded by hills that funnel wind down onto the water without warning, creating sudden, violent storms. Fishermen who worked it didn't have the luxury of predicting the weather. They worked with the understanding that the lake could kill them on any given afternoon. Now put that lake inside the Roman Empire of 28 AD. Galilee was not a peaceful province. It was the most politically volatile region in Judea, a place where revolutionary movements emerged and were crushed with enough regularity that the Romans stationed permanent garrisons not just on the coast but inland, at crossroads, at borders. The memory of the revolt of Judas of Galilee, 6 AD, was still fresh. 22 years earlier, a Galilean rebel had led an uprising against the Roman census and been publicly executed with hundreds of his followers. His sons were still alive when Jesus was preaching. This was the world. Not pastoral, not peaceful, militarized, surveilled, and riddled with people who made their living in the gray space between what Rome permitted and what Rome could actually stop. The fishing industry on the Sea of Galilee in the 1st century AD was not a cottage economy. Roman records, specifically the Annona documentation tracking grain and protein supplies across the empire, show that Galilean fish was a significant commodity. Salted and garum-processed fish from the lake was exported to markets as far as Rome itself. The town of Magdala, Migdal Nunaya in Aramaic, which translates literally as Tower of Fish, was a processing hub. Archaeological excavations beginning in 2009 uncovered industrial-scale salting pools, storage facilities, and a harbor infrastructure capable of handling dozens of vessels simultaneously. This was not a poor fishing village. It was a fish factory. And it was controlled entirely by a Roman tax system so invasive and so layered that historians estimate fishermen on the Sea of Galilee were paying, in total combined levies, somewhere between 35% and 45% of their catch in taxes. The toll for the right to fish certain waters, the toll to dock, the toll to transport, the toll to sell in market, and above all those, the Teleni system, the tax farmers, private contractors who had bought the right to collect Roman taxes and were legally permitted to extract as much as they could get, keeping the margin. Matthew, the apostle, the tax collector, was a Teleni. That is not a minor detail. In the social hierarchy of 1st century Galilee, a tax collector was not just unpopular. He was classified, in Jewish law, as ritually impure. He ate with Gentiles. He handled Roman coins. He enforced a system that many Galileans viewed as not just economically crippling, but theologically treasonous, because paying Roman taxes acknowledged Roman sovereignty over land that Jewish law said belonged to God. When Jesus sat down to eat with Matthew, he was not being unconventional. He was committing a public provocation. But here is what the tax system created, and this is where the pirates enter. When a system extracts 40% of everything you produce, you have two choices. You comply, or you find another market. The black market for Galilean fish ran through a network of coastal intermediaries, small boat operators, and what Roman military dispatches from the period describe as latrones maritimi, maritime bandits. These were not romanticized pirates. They were economic actors operating outside the Roman toll system, moving product through alternative channels, collecting their own cut, and defending their networks with violence when necessary. They operated at night, primarily. Short distances. Shore to shore, across the narrowest parts of the lake. Fast, low-profile boats that could disappear into the coves on the eastern shore, the Decapolis side, where Roman jurisdiction was nominally present but practically thin. The fishermen of Capernaum, Simon Peter's territory, John and James's territory, would have known these networks, not necessarily as participants, but as neighbors. As people you saw in the market, people whose boats occasionally came close to yours at dusk and didn't wave. People you did not ask questions about. The lake was not big enough for ignorance. Simon Peter didn't accidentally know how to navigate in the dark. He didn't accidentally know where the shoals were on the eastern shore. He didn't accidentally know how to read a Roman patrol boat's lantern pattern from 500 meters. These were survival skills in a contested economy. And then a man from Nazareth showed up on his dock and asked him to follow him. Josephus, and this is the source that changes everything, wrote two major works. the Jewish War, and Antiquities of the Jews. In the Jewish War, he describes in detail the military campaigns of Rome against Galilean rebels in the decades surrounding the life of Jesus. One passage, in Book 3, describes naval combat on the Sea of Galilee during the Roman siege of 67 AD. He writes that the rebels, Jewish fighters who had retreated to the lake, were using small fishing boats in combat formation, attempting to break through a Roman naval blockade. Josephus doesn't call them pirates. He calls them rebels. But he describes the same tactical behavior, night movement, shore knowledge, small fast craft, that Roman maritime law defined as piracy when it served Roman purposes to do so. The line between pirate and revolutionary in first-century Galilee was not a legal distinction. It was a political one. Now bring in the figure of Barabbas. The Gospel accounts of Barabbas are brief. He is introduced at the point of Jesus' trial before Pilate, identified as a prisoner who had been held for an insurrection in the city during which murder had been committed. Pilate offers to release one prisoner as a Passover custom, and the crowd chooses Barabbas over Jesus. Most readings focus on the theological symbolism. But read the Roman legal language. The specific term used in Luke 23:19, the Greek stasis, translated as insurrection, was the precise legal term Rome used for armed rebellion. Not a riot, not a street fight, an organized armed uprising against Roman authority. And Barabbas had not just participated, he had committed murder in the course of it. He was a revolutionary fighter, and he was wildly popular. Popular enough that a Jerusalem crowd, aware of what Barabbas was, chose him over a man being crucified for, officially claiming to be king of the Jews. That tells you something about the temperature of the population. It tells you something about the social context in which both men were operating. And it tells you something that the smooth, pastel-colored Sunday school version of this story has spent 2,000 years carefully not saying. The revolutionary violence that would eventually erupt into the Jewish War of 66 AD was not a sudden development. It was simmering. Openly in the streets of Jerusalem and on the shores of the Sea of Galilee for the entire 3 years that Jesus was preaching. He was not operating in a political vacuum. He was operating in a pressure cooker. Return to the lake, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Most people know the broad outline: Jesus and the disciples, a large crowd, 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, everyone fed. But pay attention to the detail that gets skipped. John 6:15. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. The crowd that followed Jesus across the lake to a remote location, specifically identified in John as being near Bethsaida, on the northeastern shore, outside Herod Antipas's direct jurisdiction, had a political agenda. They wanted to crown him by force. The Greek word used is harpaz, to seize, the same word used in Greek legal texts for violent seizure of property. This was not a religious pilgrimage. It was a revolutionary assembly. 5,000 people, in a location beyond the immediate reach of Herodian or Roman authority, looking at a man who had just fed them from nothing, and concluding that this was the person they needed to install as king by force. Jesus walked away. That decision, that specific, quiet, unspectacular decision to walk up a mountain alone rather than lead a revolution, is one of the most consequential moments in the entire gospel narrative. And almost nobody talks about what it means about the world he was moving through, because it means he knew exactly what kind of world it was. He wasn't naive about the political context. He was navigating it. Precisely. with the awareness of someone who understood that the crowd at his back was one bad decision away from a Roman massacre. And he had seen what Roman massacres looked like. Everyone in Galilee had. 30 years before the feeding of the 5,000, in 4 BC, the Roman general Varus had responded to a Galilean uprising by burning the city of Sepphoris, which was, by the way, approximately 4 miles from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, and enslaving its entire population. Roughly 2,000 people were crucified along the roads of Galilee as a warning. Jesus was not preaching in a world without memory of that. He grew up 4 miles from a city that Rome had once burned to the ground. That is not a metaphor. Here is the piece of this story that changes everything you've just heard. The town of Magdala. Mary Magdalene, in Christian tradition, one of the most prominent female followers of Jesus, the first witness to the resurrection in the Gospel of John, is identified by her hometown. Magdalene means of Magdala. Tower of Fish, the industrial fish processing city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. In 2009, archaeologists excavating beneath a planned hotel in Migdal, the modern Israeli town on the site of ancient Magdala, discovered a 1st-century synagogue, intact, still containing a carved stone now called the Magdala stone, decorated with a menorah design that predates the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It is one of the most significant 1st-century synagogue finds in the history of biblical archaeology. But they also found something else: the harbor infrastructure, the processing pools, and the economic records inscribed in administrative documents found in the ruins that tell you who was running Magdala's fish trade during the 1st century AD. Magdala was not just a processing hub, it was a transit point. Archaeological evidence suggests the city functioned as a tax collection station, one of the secondary nodes in the Telenai network, for fish moving out of the lake, which means Mary Magdalene grew up in a city that was, economically, at the intersection of the Roman tax apparatus and the black market networks that ran parallel to it. She was not from a quiet village. She was from the center of the fiscal war that defined life on the lake. Now here is the piece that has no clean historical answer, but demands to be asked. Luke 8:2 describes Mary Magdalene as a woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out. This has been interpreted theologically across centuries. But in the medical literature of the 1st century, specifically in the Hippocratic texts that were the basis of Roman-era medicine, daimonia, demons, was used interchangeably with descriptions of what we would recognize today as symptoms of severe trauma, epilepsy, and dissociative states. Josephus, in his description of the Roman assault on Magdala in 67 AD, writes that the city was taken in a combined naval and land operation. The Romans drove the civilian population into the lake. Josephus writes, with the clinical detachment of a man describing a successful military maneuver, that the lake water turned red, that bodies floated for days, that the survivors who were captured were sorted, those judged strong enough for the arena were sent to Rome. The rest were executed on the shore. This happened in 67 AD. Mary Magdalene was alive roughly 40 years before that, but the social violence that culminated in that massacre did not begin in 67 AD. It had been building for decades. Magdala in 28 AD was not a peaceful city. It was a city under economic siege, surrounded by revolutionary networks, policed by a Roman apparatus that treated its population as a taxable resource. The 7 demons that Jesus cast out of Mary Magdalene, whatever they were medically, whatever they were theologically, were not coming from nowhere. They were coming from a world that had been generating them for years. This is what the evidence points to. not as theology, as history. Jesus of Nazareth operated in one of the most politically volatile regions of the Roman Empire, at a moment when the pressure between Roman extraction and local resistance had been building for decades and would explode within 40 years of his death into the most catastrophic war in the history of Second Temple Judaism. He knew the lake. He knew the fishermen who worked it, men whose daily lives required an intimate, practical knowledge of a contested economy that operated partly inside Roman law and partly far outside it. He knew the tax collectors who enforced that system. He recruited both. He preached to crowds that included revolutionary fighters and their sympathizers. He fed 5,000 people in a location chosen, not accidentally, just beyond the easy reach of Roman authority, and then walked away when they tried to make him a king by force. He was executed on a charge of sedition. Rex Udorum, King of the Jews. Not a theological charge, a political one. The charge Rome used for anyone claiming authority that competed with Caesar. And the man the crowd chose to release instead of him was a convicted insurrectionist and killer. What does that tell you? It tells you that the story you were given, the gentle preacher in the pastoral setting, the serene lake, the simple fisherman, the apolitical kingdom, was a version of events carefully filtered through centuries of institutional religion that had very specific reasons to present Jesus as above politics, above economics, above the grinding, violent, revolutionary reality of first-century Galilee. The pirates were real. The black markets were real. The revolutionary networks were real. The trauma of a population living under military occupation and economic extraction was real. Mary Magdalene's demons were real in a way that the sanitized version of the story simply cannot hold, and Jesus walked directly into all of it, not despite knowing what it was, because he knew exactly what it was. The consequence of that choice, to operate in that world, to recruit from its margins, to refuse the crown when the crowd offered it by force, to accept the cross when Rome offered nothing else, is the hinge on which the entire subsequent history of Western civilization turns. Not because of the supernatural claims, but because of the human decision. A man who understood the political machine, who watched it grind the people around him, who had the crowd, had the moment, had every ingredient of a revolution, and chose something different. That choice, in that specific world, among those specific people, surrounded by pirates and tax collectors and revolutionary ghosts, is what made the story impossible to forget. Here is the pattern behind this story, and it shows up again and again in history, in ways that have nothing to do with religion. The official version of events is always cleaned, always smoothed, always fitted to what the institution that preserved it needed it to mean. The Romans wrote the military records that documented piracy and revolution in Galilee, and those records survived because Rome had an interest in preserving them. The early church wrote the gospel accounts, and those accounts survived because the early church had an interest in shaping what they contained. Neither version is lying, exactly. Both versions are selecting. History is always someone's edit, the actual world. The world where Mary Magdalene grew up in an industrial fish city at the center of an economic war, where Simon Peter fished a lake that Roman dispatches called a hotbed of maritime crime, where Barabbas was more popular with the Jerusalem crowd than an innocent man. That world is still there, underneath the layers. In the documents that weren't meant to be read together, in the archaeology that nobody expected to find under a hotel parking lot. You just have to know where to look, And you have to be willing to see it without flinching, because the version of history that flinches, that softens, that smooths, that edits out the pirates and the black markets and the revolutionary violence and the lake that ran red 40 years later, that version doesn't explain anything. It just makes you feel comfortable. And comfort is not understanding. If you want more stories like this, the ones that live in the gap between what you were taught and what actually happened, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe. Because the next story is already in production, and it is considerably more disturbing than this one. The Sea of Galilee is still there, still the same size, still ringed by the same hills that funnel storms down onto the water without warning. The ruins of Magdala are still being excavated. New rooms keep appearing. Every year, something surfaces that wasn't supposed to be there.